We are live.
Good to go.
Good morning. We're so glad you're here, whether it's in person or virtually. Let's open with prayer. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to be together in person or virtually. Be with us and guide us as we discern your will for us individually and as a church, as we attempt to live out our vision statement. Amen. I'm Sue Whitaker, and I'm a member of the Inclusion Committee. And today we are going to talk a little bit about inclusion, particularly as it relates to our church. The vision for Derry Church is to be an inquiring, inviting, and inclusive Christ-centered community. Hopefully that sounds familiar to most of you. This morning we're going to focus on the inclusion component of this vision, and more specifically on inclusion of individuals with disabilities. So let's take a minute and think about, when you hear the word inclusion, what immediately comes to mind? What words, phrases, or terms come to mind when you hear the word inclusion?
How about everyone?
Everyone. All right, that's a good one. Everyone. Other thoughts?
Accessibility.
Accessibility. Yeah, we often think about how do we make things accessible, not just physically accessible, but overall accessibility. Yes?
All.
I'm sorry?
All.
Fall?
A-L-L. All.
All, okay, yeah, these masks. All, right, all means all.
Listening?
Listening.
Welcoming?
Welcoming. I think of embracing differences. Maybe participation? Any other ideas?
Sometimes modifying.
Modifying in order to get to participation. All right, so those are all different words that we think of when we think about inclusion. The Oxford Dictionary says, defines inclusion as the act of including someone or something as part of a group, and inclusion is including, but being a part of. And I think that was one we actually had, didn't we? Being a part of? No, we didn't have that one. Being a part of. It's the idea that everyone should be able to use the same facilities, take part in the same activities, and enjoy the same experiences. So it's being not just a part of, but being able to access the facility and access the activities and the different things that are actually going on. Another definition that I like is allowing many different types of people to do something and treating them fairly and equally, but not necessarily the same. So again, you're trying to figure out how we can get all different people with a variety of different needs to be able to do something. And remembering that when we treat people equally, it doesn't necessarily mean treating them the same. For example, I have to wear glasses. And so I wear my glasses. But if I were to give my glasses and say, well, you know, in order to be fair, we're all here together, in order to be fair, everyone should have the same thing. So now everyone needs to be wearing these exact same glasses. And what's going to happen? My glasses are right strong, people. Some of you are going to have a real hard time seeing through these glasses. It's not going to make things better. It's going to make things worse. But if we're really going to treat everybody the same, we all have to wear the exact same glasses. And that obviously would be ridiculous. So when we talk about inclusion, we're not talking about treating everybody the same, but we are talking about giving them the same opportunities to access everything that's going on, and particularly, as we're talking, everything that's going on here at Derry. We're focusing over the next 2 weeks, particularly on inclusion of individuals with disabilities. So let's talk about disabilities, because sometimes we narrow our focus too much. when we think about disabilities. In reality, at least 1 in every 3 families is touched by disability. And you think, well, I don't have a disabled child in my house, and neither do my kids. Nah, that's not just what we're talking about. In my family, for example, my mother, she's going to be 93 this month. And yet, she uses a walker, so we have to think about accessibility. When my father went through this several years ago, it became so obvious to me, and you would think as a special educator that was my life, but my father still liked to get out, and he was in a wheelchair. And it became a major ordeal to get him to the bathroom because I had to do it. And there are so many places that have a men's room and a ladies' room. Well, how do I get my dad to the bathroom? I can't take him to the ladies' room, or I have to go to the men's room. And I just loved it when we got to a place that had a generic bathroom, and we didn't have to worry about that sort of thing. That's accessibility. But we'd plan ahead. Or my husband would go and make sure the restroom was clear, because he wasn't taking my dad to the bathroom, but make sure the restroom was clear and then stand outside while I took my father. It gets complicated. So disabilities are many kinds. When we talk about disabilities, we're thinking about temporary disabilities, like a broken leg. Thank goodness that heals, and then you don't have a problem anymore, hopefully. So it could be a temporary disability, or it could be a long-term disability, multiple sclerosis, cerebral palsy. It can be a very mild disability, mild hearing loss, or it can be a very severe disability, totally deaf, and dependent on sign language. So many kinds. We're looking at hearing disabilities, vision disabilities, speech, various types of physical disabilities, health impairments. We don't always think about that. But severe allergies, like a peanut allergy that can be life-threatening, that's pretty significant when you get on a plane and they start serving peanuts. So that can be a disability. Attention deficit disorder, learning disabilities, cognitive and intellectual disabilities, Alzheimer's, dementia, as well as Down syndrome and other types of intellectual disabilities. Emotional disabilities, anxiety, depression, bipolar, autism spectrum disorder, and then multiple disabilities where you have several. So very broad term overall. We're thinking about disabilities across the age span, birth to death. So we're not just talking about children, the elderly, whatever, all the way through. And we're thinking about disabilities from mild to severe. So why is this an issue? Well, as I mentioned, if 1 in 3 households, at least, is touched by a disability, then that's an issue here at Derry. It's often an unseen issue, mainly because if you can't access the programs, you don't go, right? And so nobody sees them and nobody thinks about it. And yet there are probably a lot of people that would like to access some other programs, activities here that maybe can't do it. Now, Derry's done a lot to make the church accessible, and Christy's going to talk about that in a minute. But there are other things left to do. So it's definitely an issue that touches a lot of different people. Why is it important? Well, we talk a lot about social justice. Individuals with disabilities are often a marginalized group. And if we're really going to focus on social justice, you can't just leave out this whole big group. So we want to make sure that that's included. It's an equality issue. Just like you wouldn't say, well, you know, if your skin is this color, there's no place for you. We want to make sure that there's a place for everybody if we're really going to live out our vision of being an inclusive church. Individuals with disabilities are a part of society and a contributing part of society. There could be people in this room with a disability and you may not know it because many disabilities are hidden, and we just keep going and do what we need to do. So individuals with disabilities can contribute to the church in many, many ways. And they need to not just be able to come into the church, but be able to be an important part of the church and find where they can best contribute to the church. Many of the hardships of disabilities are actually external to the individual. It's not the fact that you're in a wheelchair that creates the major disability. It comes from other people in the environment in which they live, particularly other people's perceptions. And so we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about perceptions. Too often when we see someone in a wheelchair, we think, oh well, you're in a wheelchair, I'm going to talk to the person pushing the wheelchair because you're not capable of deciding what you want to eat. It was amazing to me how many times I'd go out with my dad or my mom, and they'd ask me, what do they want to eat? I don't know, ask them. But we sometimes make that assumption. So it's other people's perceptions. And then the physical environment. Dad's perfectly capable of going to a restaurant as long as we make sure that there's a ramp so we can get in and there's room between the tables. You wouldn't believe how many times that's gotten a little better with COVID as we spread out. But trying to actually maneuver a wheelchair through a restaurant can be a huge issue. So it's oftentimes the physical environment and people's perceptions that really create the disability. And so we want to make sure that here at Derry, we're doing everything we can to truly make Derry an inclusive church. And our job as the Inclusion Committee is to focus particularly on including individuals with disabilities. So Pastor Pam is going to talk a little bit about that from a biblical standpoint. And Pam, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Righty, well, thank you so much. Okay. So there are 4 key things that I want to put out there this morning about inclusion from a biblical standpoint, a biblical theology of inclusion. The first is that every person reflects God's image. It's a theme that's repeated throughout the Bible, but nowhere is it more explicit than the first time it's brought up, which is right in the beginning in Genesis 1, where Genesis 1 verses 26 and 27 say, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness. So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, God created them." So all humankind, all human beings are created in God's image, created in God's likeness. And as image bearers of God, every person has an intrinsic value that cannot be denied and must be celebrated. Colossians reminds us that as Christians, we are being renewed in knowledge after the image of the Creator. The second key that I have is that everyone has been placed in this world for a purpose. Every individual should have the opportunity to realize, understand, and accomplish their purpose. God works inside of, not in spite of what we humans may perceive as weakness. 2 Corinthians says, "God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong." So God's household is a web of partnerships between people, all of whom are a mix of strength and weakness, gift and need, whether having a disability or not. And I think it's important here to stop and remember that Jesus was both fully God and fully human. I'm doing a Lenten study series with the youth on shame, resilience, and vulnerability. And one of the things we've talked about is how it's easy to picture Jesus sitting on his heavenly throne and forget about the vulnerability and the dustiness in his life. And so while we don't necessarily read in the Bible specifically that Jesus had a disability, we do get to see some of his more vulnerable places in his life. So we see Jesus feeling human emotions, we see Jesus crying. Famously, the shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept. Jesus gets overwhelmed at times and needs space. He needs alone time. Multiple times we read that Jesus went off on his own to pray, or sent his disciples ahead of him so that he could have some space. For example, the story where Jesus walks on water comes immediately after one of those times where Jesus takes some time alone and goes up a mountain to pray. And then there's the time when Jesus got angry enough to flip tables in the temple. This is one of the rare stories that gets told in all 4 of the Gospels, so it's got to be a pretty important one. Not that the others aren't important. But so it's in all 4 of the Gospels, and the Gospel of John even says that he made a whip out of materials that he found and used it to drive the animals that were being sold in the temple out of that space. Flipping tables and making whips, that's a lot of anger. And no matter how righteous that anger is, it sounds like something that we today might call like a violent outburst. So we are all human. We are all dusty and we're all vulnerable, and so was Jesus. But also, like Jesus, we are full of God's strength, and we're given varied and important gifts from God. And the call to serve our neighbor is given to everyone. Jesus doesn't say, love your neighbor as yourself, except for you people over there. That's not what the scripture says. It says, teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all of the law and the prophets. The third key point is that every person deserves our best. God calls us to give our best as our responsibility to others. In Luke 21, we read, Jesus looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on. So God expects people to faithfully use the gifts that God has given to them, regardless of how those gifts might be measured on some human scale. We are all equally broken, and we are all equally called to be servants of one another. And the final key point in a biblical, I don't want to say argument, but a biblical discussion of disability is that every partnership is valuable. Interacting with others creates relationship that is vital to every person's development. This is the longest scripture I'm going to read. It's from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and it may be a familiar one. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in the one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. Indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot were to say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear were to say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole body were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as God chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many members, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and those members of the body that we think less honorable, we clothe with greater honor. And our less respectable members are treated with greater respect. Whereas our more respectable members do not need this. But God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension within the body, but the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. So we can't go it alone. Faith is a journey that requires partnerships and community along the way. Everyone brings their different gifts and their different talents to the table, and where we ourselves are lacking, someone else will excel. If we aren't including everyone at the table, we are missing out on amazing and important gifts and opportunities. So there are a number of miracle stories in the Bible where Jesus heals someone with a disease or a disability. The paralytic man who was lowered through the roof by his friends, lepers who had been ostracized from their communities, blind people, deaf people. And I have specifically chosen to skip over those stories this morning. Yes, they do show that Jesus cared for and helped people regardless of their illness or level of ability. However, a message from a deaf colleague constantly holds a place in the back of my mind when I read some of these stories. Now, this was only one man's view, but in his sermon during his senior year chapel service, Noah, a classmate of mine at Princeton Seminary and a now ordained pastor who also happens to be deaf, said this. He said, I'm glad that Jesus healed the deaf man in Mark 7, but I wouldn't want Jesus to do that now if he were here. That man had no community, no good way of communicating, but we have developed all of that now. Jesus' healing of the deaf man was not about removing the man's disability, but rather removing the impediment to being a part of his community. And I think that that is the key, the main key. We are called by God to be an inclusive community. It's not our job to fix people or to make them fit into our mold. It's our calling to do what we can to remove the barriers that get in the way of full participation within our community. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over. Oh, before I turn it over to Christy, I am going to have to go to middle school, high school, Sunday school. So any questions anyone has on this part of the presentation, because I won't be able to be here at the end for questions about the whole thing. Are we seeing any questions coming online?
Yep.
All right, then I will turn it over to Christy.
Good morning. We just have to make a little adjustment.
Sometimes it's hard to be a short person.
Sometimes it's very hard to be a short person. It's really nice to be 5'10" here, which is what someone said I looked like this morning. So, good morning. My name's Christy Elliott. I'm a member of Deering Church, a member of the Christian Education Committee, and was instrumental in starting our subcommittee on inclusion and accessibility. So what I'm going to do this morning is tell you a little bit about how we got started. Back in December 2019 and January 2020, which if any of you keep track of time the way I do, pre-pandemic, you know, that's kind of our reference point now. I went to Christian Education and asked them if it was all right if I started a subcommittee to look at this whole idea of accessibility and inclusion. Not because I thought we were doing things incorrectly here at Dairy, but just with a sense that there were probably more things that we could do. And of course, Christian Ed gave me their blessing. So we pulled together a team. I'm very thankful for the members who are here today and have helped present this morning. We really knew from the beginning that we needed to think through how we were going to approach this, because so often when a term like inclusion or disability is heard, we have kind of an image in our mind. Some people may think of a child who has cerebral palsy or who is blind. Some may think of an adult who has certain disabilities or certain challenges to accessibility. So we wanted to make sure, number one, that we were being very broad-based in our approach. So our initial goal, as we made our decision, was to identify barriers in our physical structure, our communication, or our attitudes that might hinder full participation in congregational life. And that was a really key point for us. We weren't just talking about, can someone get into the sanctuary for worship? Certainly that's important. We want to be accessible. That really touches on what we think of as physical accessibility. So being able to get into worship is really important. And at Dairy, we have a ramp, we have doors that open automatically, we have an elevator. Those really address physical accessibility. But we wanted to make sure that we were an inclusive church, and by allowing individuals to access whatever aspects of congregational life they chose. If someone wanted to be involved in a Bible study but had difficulty with hearing, was there a way that they could be included? If someone was in a wheelchair and wanted to sing in the choir, is there a way we can provide that accessibility? So we wanted to look at all aspects of congregational life. We also wanted to make sure, of course, that we aligned with Dairy Presbyterian's vision of being an inquiring, inviting, and inclusive Christ-centered community. And we wanted to align with God's vision of creating a space where all individuals are encouraged to use their own special gifts and talents to glorify God. In addition to a goal, we back in January 2020 defined some objectives. First of all, we wanted to look at ways that Dairy was already providing accommodations. I mentioned some of them. You know, we have ramps, we have elevators, we have doors that open. We had large print bulletins. We have auditory amplifying devices, personal auditory amplifying devices that individuals can use. So we were already doing a lot of things, but we wanted to look at that. We wanted to look at ways that other faith-based communities were increasing or improving their ability to include individuals with varied learning and accommodation needs into their congregational life. And then we wanted to make sure that we were making recommendations to Dairy that were supported by the information that we had found. So our first step was figuring out what was going on in other faith-based communities. We used a lot of information from Presbyterian Church USA, a lot of information out there, and from other faith-based organizations. We also did a search I remember looking at just local churches' websites, and any that mentioned inclusion, some of them talked specifically about disability ministries. We tried to get in touch with them. So we talked to some of these churches by phone, made visits to some, one in particular, to get a sense of why they had started their ministry, what made it important to their congregation, and kind of how it had progressed. One thing that was so interesting to me was, and it was very common among all of those churches, and they were all churches, was that they all said they had started their programs or their mission based on the needs of a particular family or an individual. You know, typically maybe a family had said, I have a child, you know, you name the issue or the disability. And we want to make sure we address this within the church. And so kind of the programming started from there and went very well. But what all of those organizations said was, but now we don't do that anymore, we do something different. And it was kind of a real red flag to me that we need to make sure that we're looking very broadly at our congregation, that we don't just focus on one area, one age group, or one particular type of challenge, that we're looking at things broadly. And all of those churches also said, you know, we continue to do programming, but it's just not the same. You know, now it's looking at a broader segment of our congregation. So that was incredibly important to us. In addition to that, and that was probably one of the biggest takeaways from the local churches that we talked to. Don't just focus on one thing, make sure you know what's needed. So most of the articles and books that we read talked about that too. They talked about assessing the needs of your congregation, finding a way to find out where the needs are. Some other important conclusions from our research: be sure that you have staff support. Structure all your recommendations based on needs. Well, that makes sense. Education and training. That was incredibly important, and that was another common theme. Make sure that we provide education for staff and church leaders. Make sure people understand where we're going and why we think it's important to move in this direction. They talked a lot too about training for what I would call frontline volunteers. Ushers, greeters, committee heads. You know, I think about that a little bit like when you walk into an office, the first person you see isn't the doctor or the insurance agent or whoever you're visiting. It's the receptionist, right? Or the secretary. And think back, if you walk into an office and you don't feel that that individual is welcoming or happy or able to answer your questions, it really colors how you view that next person that you see. And I'll tell you, there have been times I know that personally, I haven't gone back to an office because I've been so put off by that frontline person. Now, our ushers and our greeters, our frontline people here at Dairy are nothing but welcoming and kind. But what we want to make sure is that they feel very comfortable if individuals arrive who have specific questions. I'm in a wheelchair, is there a place for me? You know, my walker's kind of big, is there going to be a place for me to store it during the service? You know, when we have information, then we feel more comfortable presenting it and feel more comfortable answering the questions and feel more comfortable saying, you know what, I don't know, but I'll find out. The other takeaway that was probably wasn't unusual for me, but it was also common, was that individuals with varied intellectual, sensory, mobility, hearing, communication, and vision needs want to be fully engaged in congregational life. No one wants to feel marginalized. Some people feel like it's just what has to be. And we want to make sure that members of our congregation don't have that sense. So those were some of the things that we took away. So what were we going to do with it? Well, we knew we needed staff support. We updated dairy staff regularly. Pastor Pam came onto our committee. Emmy Steelman has joined our committee at various times. But we update our staff regularly. On a monthly basis, I update Christian Ed on what we're doing. We talked about assessing the congregation, and that's a tricky area. At first, we've talked a lot about doing a congregational assessment. In fact, we looked at some really nice ones that are out there and modified them for one that would be appropriate for Dairy Church. There are pros and cons with trying to do that. You often don't get a lot of participation, but my thought is if you even get one or two people who answer, maybe that's worth it. So that's still being discussed. Oops. And then, we did all that in January and February 2020. And then, March 2020 arrived. And so the church building was shut down. Everything in our lives changed. And our committee had to kind of pivot as well. We were no longer talking about getting into church and doing this and doing that and surveying the congregation. Church was kind of on survival mode, right? So a lot of things were on hold. We did do some things during that pandemic time. We did some articles for the e-news. One was helping individuals with hearing loss to optimize virtual meetings. We added a question because remember we had to register for Zoom events and different things. There was a question that said, will you need any special accommodation to attend this virtual event? Because, maybe that's something we hadn't thought of. But it was not exactly the way we had chosen to move forward. So, we kind of slowed to a snail pace. But then summer and fall came, and especially this past fall of 2021, when things were really opening up again. And we started thinking about education and training. We knew assessment was important, but we thought, education and training. How do we want to structure that? Where do we need to start? So we knew that general information for the congregation was important, which has led us to issues class. We decided this was a good way to perhaps present information to a larger segment. We presented some training to Dairy Discovery Day staff. They had requested some training, and we were glad to present that. We've had ongoing discussion regarding the type and structure of training for Dairy Church leaders, including elders and deacons and committee chairpersons, ushers and greeters. We've had ongoing discussions regarding training for children's ministry volunteers, and ongoing discussions regarding congregational needs assessment. I want to talk for just a minute about children's ministry. At one point throughout this, and especially when we started opening up again, our children's ministry coordinator presented some questions to us, and we started looking at, was there a niche area that we needed to be involved in sooner rather than later? One of the things that we did right away, there is a general medical and information form that's required when children attend our Tuesday night programs. So we added a question to that says, does your child have any physical or intellectual accessibility needs? And please let us know how we can help. We wanted to make sure that families knew we were thinking about them. And if there was anything they needed to share with us, or ways that they thought we could help their child be more comfortable and safer coming Tuesday night, we wanted to know. If a parent indicates that the child might have some needs, then our children's ministry coordinator speaks with the parent. And just to assess, this is what changes might need to be made, if there's anything that she can do, if there's any way that she can make sure that that child can attend without any disruption to them, and to feel safe and feel comfortable and to learn. If the coordinator decides that some additional classroom support might be needed, then she contacts our inclusion committee. And our inclusion team or representatives have met with the children's ministry coordinator, with parents, to talk through what support the child may require in school, how we can mimic that here if we can, and how to help that child, again, enjoy Tuesday nights, be safe, learn, and have the experience that we want them to have. And our Tuesday Night Kid Club is functioning in that model right now and functioning quite well. So where do we go next? Well, we're still talking about how to know what the needs of the congregation are. And I'm interested in knowing what you all think about that, because it's there's a lot of different ways to go on it, but that's something that we know from the very beginning is important. We're considering, do we look at specific questions, rather than a big survey, do we ask users of the auditory amplifiers if the devices are functioning well? Or do they have any other ideas? There's things that would be more targeted. We definitely then need to respond to any needs assessments with concrete recommendations. We're going to continue to utilize our present process for Kid Club, but we need to develop a process to assure that children who are choosing to attend other children's ministry programs, Sunday school, VBS, fellowship programs, that they receive the appropriate level of support if needed. We need to develop a process for securing interested volunteers to provide that support. And we need to make decisions to provide training for church leaders and volunteers. So we've got a lot on our plates. One of the first steps, like we said, is to providing information to the congregation, which we're hoping to do today, and to get input. And also interest from individuals who may be interested either in joining our group or have good concrete ideas that we would welcome. I'd like to close with one of the verses actually that Pam used, but it speaks to me when we talk about inclusion, when I think about inclusion, and it's the 1 Corinthians, verse 12 actually. It's the verse that talks about, it's the area in the Bible that talks about spiritual gifts. And verses 4 to 6 say, there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. And there are different kinds of workings, but the same God works all of them in all men, not just in sighted people, not just in people with excellent hearing, or people who can walk well on 2 legs or have high intelligence, but all people. God gives his gifts to all, and so it's our responsibility as a church community to make sure that we provide an accessible, inviting, and welcoming place where all who choose can fully participate in church life. And now, we'd like to have some discussion, because we do have a live audience here. Some ideas, well, before we do that, actually, I want to remind the people here and the people who are viewing us on live stream, we will do a part 2 next Sunday. We hope you'll attend. For those of you who are live streaming, the live stream will start at about 3 to 4 minutes after 9. In person, we will be viewing a short video, and there will be a connection that you can view, you live streamers can view that later. But just to know, if you tune in at 9 o'clock, the live stream won't be starting for you until about 3 to 4 minutes afterwards. Okay? So we hope everyone will attend. I'm going to open up the list to questions or comments. And yes?
Happy to hear what you're saying and see what you're doing. I think everybody has some kind of challenge that they're dealing with. A lot of people find it hard to talk about. I think one of the easiest ways for people to open up is to talk one-on-one with someone they trust. I'm not a big fan of surveys, but I think if you feel comfortable with someone, you can talk to them about it, and then you can figure out, the best way to go forward.
No, good point. I think one of the videos we'll see next week talks about inclusion programs aren't about programs, they're about relationships. And, you know, the comment that we just had is that individuals may be much more comfortable talking one-to-one rather than answering a survey or something like that. So, good point. And I guess to that then, you might agree that the more we can spread the word to the general congregation would be important.
Yeah, I actually believe, I think it's necessary. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We're hoping that as people hear about the Inclusion Committee and what we're doing, because I think a lot of people don't even know there is an Inclusion Committee. Some of you may not have known that. We're hoping that as they learn more about the committee and its role, that they'll feel comfortable reaching out to the committee. And we have had, particularly parents, reaching out to us about particular needs for their children. Haven't had as many adults reaching out yet. But certainly we're hoping that will happen as they know we're here and what we're trying to do. People will reach out with ideas and feel comfortable discussing. You know, there are certain disabilities that people just find harder to discuss, and often they're the hidden disabilities, and therefore people don't even know. I think particularly about some of the mental health issues. It's not like you can see it. And so, but they may need more support, and we need to know that. So hopefully, y'all can help spread the word as well. If you hear of something, reaching out to the pastors, to the staff, and to the committee so that we can find ways to support.
Right, and that's a very good point. Individuals can certainly go through our clergy, our staff, who are all aware of our committee, and often that is what has happened, quite frankly, in the past, that individuals have reached out to a pastor who has then gotten in touch with us.
I just wanted to comment that I think today this really helped in terms of awareness. And before any issue is addressed, you have to be aware of the issue. So I would look forward to any activities that are done that integrate awareness into the activity of the congregation.
Okay.
Just to raise that awareness and sensitivity to these issues.
Mm-hmm.
I think when you do that, and you indeed are dealing with some sort of disability or you're limited in some way, if you're conscious of the fact that people around you are aware and more sensitive, you yourself will be more forthcoming with what your needs are. So I'd be all for any activities or to raise the awareness on a continuous, I don't know how you do that. It's up to the committee.
Well, that's, and you're on the committee.
Yeah. Talking to myself here.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not, I mean, when we're talking about something, just as we kind of put it on, as Sue mentioned, individuals who've reached out to us have been parents who had concerns for their children. And it is, at this point, a little less likely that we hear from individuals who may not think that there have, you know, what can I say? Not that that may not feel that our committee is looking at their situation. Someone who says, well, you know, gee, I'd like to come now that we're meeting again, or we have in-person GIF groups, or I'd like to come, but oh, it's, you know, I can manage it on Zoom because I don't move too well. You know, I have to use that walker and that's hard, or my hearing's getting worse and worse, and I'm just can't really, you know, unless somebody uses a mic, I can't really manage it. I think those are the individuals in our congregation that we really hope we can reach, because essentially a lot of the accommodations that we can address are really not talking about huge structural changes to our church. They can be very small things, but they can be really impacting for someone. And the other part of that is, just like Kay mentioned, individuals being aware and then knowing that that person beside them, you know, is probably willing to help too. And the person in front of them may be willing to help. You know, that's what a congregation is all about. You know, that's what makes us the church we are. That we want to be not only welcoming, but welcoming and helpful in the best ways that we can. I know that's a lot of what Stephanie's going to talk about next week. Anything else?
Might want to just mention what we're going to focus on next week.
Okay, next week, well, Stephanie is going to be our speaker next week. She's going to talk about some ways that we're moving forward. Some easy ways, talking about language, I think, and just some ways that we can all be more aware of how we relate, what we can do within the church, and quite frankly, within our community. We have a video, as I mentioned before, that will be at the beginning. It's about 3 minutes long, but we think it's...
I'm glad I'm not the only one that was having trouble with those things. I feel much better.
See if we can get this in.
It's the same one too.
Okay.
I know.
It's about 3 minutes long, but it's a worthwhile little video. And then we also have a video at the end that I think will be very, very informative and very inspirational for everyone. So we're excited about next week. We hope everybody will be back. We hope our live stream audience will be back, and maybe some other people. Next week is Palm Sunday, so hopefully we will have a lot of people here in the church building. Anything else?
Maybe let them know if they would like to contact the committee, how to reach us.
Well, I think the best way, Sue just mentioned, if anyone would like to contact our committee, I do think the best way is just to call the church office. Everyone in the church office is well aware of our committee, and they will get in touch with me directly. Now, well, let's close in prayer then. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share today with our live audience, with our live stream audience, to share your word and to share the vision of inclusivity here at Derry. Please be with all of us this week and help us to go into your world thinking about how we can be as inclusive to all members of your world as we can possibly be. In the name of your Son we pray, amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.